Hello, my name is Pearl Barnes, and this is the presentation for my inquiry-based comparative education study. So the topic I've chosen to focus on for my inquiry-based comparative study is the education of Indigenous people in Euro-Colonized countries. I'm going to be looking at Indigenous education in both Canada and Australia, as their histories are alarmingly similar. I'll be covering three main topics in my short presentation: the history of both countries, the reconciliation efforts of both countries, and what kind of pedagogies arise out of decolonized education. At the end, I'll be looking at what the implications are of those pedagogies. The inquiry question I would like to answer by the end of this presentation is: what are the ways in which Australia and Canada have fostered reconciliation and decolonization in education, and what are the effects of that work? So, first and foremost, the history of education. We're all familiar with the dark history of Canada's residential schools and how it was the Canadian government's way of eradicating Indigenous people and their cultures entirely. Residential schools first opened officially in 1883, but Christian schools created to assimilate Indigenous people date all the way back to the 1600s. The last residential school in Canada closed in 1996. Australia had a very similar system, with the first boarding school, also known as dark schools, opening in 1879 and the last one closing in 1984. These schools were also government funded and church run, with a goal of educating Aboriginal children properly and destroying their culture. Flash forward in time to the late 20th century and early 21st century, residential and boarding schools in both countries are closing or closed, but that doesn't mean the problem of cultural extermination is fixed. Especially in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, Canada's curriculum is either lacking in Indigenous history and ways of knowing, or encourages teachers to include it but makes no mention of how to go about that. A good example of this is the Social 10 curriculum from 1992, which makes note of appropriate inclusion of Indian and Métis content, but makes no mention of history or the genocide of Indigenous people on behalf of the Canadian government. Australia had similar problems, especially in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Not only were the Aboriginal children discriminated against in schools, but Aboriginal history and cultural diversity were not a part of Australia's curriculum until 1991, when there was a national inquiry into racism and racial violence. Currently, in 2021, the educational systems of both countries are better at including Indigenous history and knowledge, and that is due primarily to the reconciliation efforts of both countries. So in Canada, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was founded in 2008 after the official apology to residential school survivors. The Commission released 94 calls to action demanding real and meaningful change in Canada for Indigenous people. In Education for Reconciliation, the TRC calls for K-12 curriculum on Indigenous history, better education for teacher candidates on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods in the classroom, and to establish a national research program to advance understanding of reconciliation, among other things. Essentially, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to strengthen the knowledge of Indigenous ways of knowing, history, and reconciliation for future generations in an impactful way. Australia has a similar story. Reconciliation Australia was founded in 2001, replacing the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, which was established in 1991. Similar to the 94 calls to action, Reconciliation Australia has a strategic action plan that focuses on 8 goals that coincide with 5 aspects of Aboriginal identity: race relations, equity and equality, institutional integrity, unity, and historical acceptance. Every one of these dimensions circles back to education in some way, calling for more in-depth history of Aboriginal people, teaching anti-racism and cultural understanding, and partnering with governments, stakeholders, and education providers to help close the gap in Aboriginal life outcomes, especially graduation rates of Aboriginal youth. Keeping this history in mind, I wanted to look at the present. I looked at a few different studies on current education of both Indigenous people in Canada and Aboriginal people in Australia. The studies explored good teaching practices and pedagogies for Aboriginal students in Australia as well as Indigenous students in Canada. There were three main pedagogies that stood out to me: culturally responsive education, low-key responses to behavioral management, and interactive communication. So with culturally responsive strategies, the focus in a few of the articles I looked at was cultural competency and relationship building. Students have a better chance of learning when they have a meaningful connection and relationship with the teacher, and that relationship can only be built if the teacher understands cultural differences and can set aside their own cultural biases. It's important that we understand past and present Indigenous issues so that we can develop cultural understanding and relationship building. In terms of low-key responses to behavioral management, the idea behind this pedagogy or strategy is that through building relationships and developing mutual respect and understanding, you don't have to have an authoritarian style of classroom management. Allowing students to manage themselves and providing very low-key guiding management helps to reduce undesirable behavior without tarnishing the relationship to discourage the students. Largely because of intergenerational trauma, many Indigenous students can approach education in an apathetic or distrustful way. Rather than trying to combat this, we have to encourage them with a student-centered approach. And finally, interactive communication. This is both about making students feel listened to and supported in the classroom environment, and also figuring out how to connect lessons to the things they already know. It's important for Indigenous students to feel connected to what they're learning, so by opening a line of dialogue, you can relate your lessons to their lives. So, what all three of these pedagogies or strategies have in common is learning and respect. Learning from your students, lifelong learning to keep up with current Indigenous issues, and overall just respecting where they come from. Finally, what do we do with this knowledge? What is the implication of all of this, and why do we care? Well, the original inquiry question was, what are the ways in which Australia and Canada have fostered reconciliation and decolonization in education, and what are the effects of this work? The decolonization process in both Canada and Australia has been ongoing. Including Indigenous education is the first step, and that has been mostly well received. Many schools are including Indigenous spiritual beliefs in religious studies, and a lot of schools in Canada have smudging rooms and opportunities for students to learn more about their culture or language. Australia has put in place mandatory Aboriginal history components in their curriculum and offer traditional Aboriginal art and music classes. The next steps will also be ongoing, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding how it should happen. How much of traditional Western ideals of education and schooling should stay? How much can we change? How long will it take? Because of the persistent racism and biases that exist even in the educational ministries in both countries, it's hard to tell what the next steps are. However, we've already seen positive effects of decolonization in education. In 2019, Indigenous graduation rates across British Columbia had risen 68% over the course of the past 5 years. And the retention rate for Aboriginal students in Australia rose from 58.9% to 62.4% in the 1-year gap between 2016 and 2017. There are more Indigenous students than ever going into post-secondary institutions and then becoming teachers who will carry on this cycle. In both countries, decolonizing educational systems has seen entirely positive effects for Indigenous students. Comparing Canadian and Australian history of Indigenous people is not new or groundbreaking, but it's still important. By using comparative education as a lens, we can set good and bad examples for one another and learn from each other on how to make educational institutions equitable for Indigenous students. There's a lot more work to do, but the more we learn about the issue, the more we can combat it. And that concludes my presentation on Indigenous education in Canada and Australia. Thank you.